All right, hello everyone. So today what we're going to talk about is continue our talk about energy and how do we as consumer get energy from producers, right? So producers are the ones you recall that can actually create their own food, and then in the process of creating food, they can actually use that food source for themselves with regards to energy. So this is chapter 6 and it's on photosynthesis. Okay, so photosynthesis is the transformation of solar energy into chemical energy. So solar energy is this energy that we're getting from the sun. Chemical energy, because it's the energy that is in between the bonds that make up carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, if you recall, is like glucose, fructose, sucrose. Sucrose is a saccharide. So remember that the monomer for carbohydrates are saccharide. Disaccharide would be two saccharide monomers together, and a polysaccharide would be multiple, right? Poly, so multiple saccharide together. So the chemical energy is the energy that's stored between those carbon-carbon bonds that's in a glucose molecule. So producers are able to feed themselves because they're able to make their own energy. We as consumer, as well as most other living organisms on this planet, will consume producers or consume consumers that have consumed producers in order for us to get our energy. The producers that are able to make their own energy using solar energies are plants, but it's not limited to plants. It also includes algae, and it also includes some cyanobacteria. So here on the right side, you can see a bunch of different images of algae and of different cyanobacteria, and of course of plants that can all be producers. So producers take water from the ground, right? Or actually they can also absorb water through their leaves, but they take water and they take carbon dioxide. So think each time that you're breathing, you're actually in a way indirectly feeding plants, right? So carbon dioxide, and combining that with light energy to get the energy source, they create new bonds, and that new bond results in a carbohydrate being formed, so glucose being formed, as well as a byproduct, which is oxygen. So plants release that oxygen when they're actually undergoing photosynthesis. So where does oxygen come out of? They come from the result of making carbohydrate. The carbon dioxide pretty much comes from us, like consumers, that breathe it to them. And then the water comes from different ways that they can absorb it. So they can absorb it in the root leaf, but like certain plants, like those trees that we actually will see in our forests in California that are really tall, you would think that, where did they get their water source from, right? Because they think about how the fact that when you do absorb water from the ground, how it has to travel all the way up to those leaves on the very top, so they can actually absorb water from fog and from atmosphere. That's the reason why certain tree species, fog is really important, because that's how they actually are able to get their water source from. So the organelle um, that synthesize and during photosynthesis in plants and proteins are the chloroplasts. Okay, so here is a picture of a chloroplast. It's kind of a blurry picture. It's from your book, so you should be able to reference it. So the chloroplast consists of a thyroid membrane. So that's right here. The thylakoid membrane is encapsulating the thylakoid, and the thylakoid has chlorophyll and other pigments that reside within the thylakoid membrane. So these structures that you see here that looks like green Oreo cookies, those are called guarana. And so there's stacks of chlorophyll and other pigments that are stored in these guaranas. And these pigments is what's actually absorbing that solar energy. So the stroma is the space in between the guarana, and that's where we'll actually have carbon dioxide being reduced here into carbohydrates. So the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere is able, alongside with water and sun energy, is able to produce some carbohydrate, which is the sugar, and glucose is the main source of energy for most organisms. We do get energy from other sources, right? We do get energy from our lipids and our protein, but glucose, specifically glucose within the carbohydrate realm, is our main source of energy. Okay, so the two steps that I kind of want you to recognize with regards to photosynthesis is the first one is the light reaction that actually happens in the thylakoid membrane, and then the Calvin cycle reaction that actually happens in the stroma. So just think of this in order, how the first thing that kind of happens is that you actually have the light energy from the sun actually being used so that we can transfer it into an energy source that's usable by the plant. That's ATP and NADPH, right? We're going to actually break up the water molecule, split it up. That's where we get our oxygen from. And we're going to actually use the hydrogen within our carbohydrates itself. So we're going to take the hydrogen, link it with the CO2, and that's how we end up with carbohydrate. Because remember that the glucose molecule has C, H, and O in it, right? So that's the first part, is the light reaction. The second part of the photosynthesis is the Calvin cycle reaction. This happens in the stroma. And this is when we actually use the energy that's in ATP and in NADPH. So these two have the actual energy source, and they're going to be used to drive the synthesis of actually making glucose. So we're going to take energy from breaking up the bonds in ATP and bringing it down to ADP and use that to synthesize the glucose and other carbohydrates. And our original reactant products are the carbohydrates, carbon dioxide, and water. So light reaction using power of sun, and then Calvin cycle reaction using energy that's from ATP and NADPH. And all of this is to make glucose. So we're actually making our own sugar in this process. Okay, so let's look at the light reaction in a little more detail. So this happens in the thylakoid membrane, right? What's going to happen is chlorophyll is able to absorb that energy from the sun. In the process of absorbing this energy, is able to stimulate some electrons and get the electrons all excited. Yay! So they get all excited. And then that energy from the electrons is then pushed into ATP and NADP plus. NAD plus we can also consider as an electron carrier. So it's going to grab this electron and carry it over. And so now we converted light energy into a usable energy for the organism. That's the ATP and the NADPH. We then move to the Calvin cycle. So now we have this energy. And with that energy, we're going to take up carbon dioxide, and we're going to now convert that carbon dioxide into the actual glucose, which is made of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Okay, so let's think about the pigment that's in the chlorophyll, and why is it green, right? So the chlorophyll contains chloroplast, and the cells have chloroplast, and the chloroplast has the thylakoid membrane. Inside the thylakoid membrane is the pigment. Chlorophyll is one of those pigments. Chlorophyll is the main pigment that we see. And over on the right side, I'm showing you some wavelengths. And what I want you to recognize is that whatever color you see as you look around, look at your shirt, look at your I don't know, whatever's in your room right now. Look at it and see, what color do we see? Well, the color that we see is actually the one that typically is the one that's being reflected back to us. So this is kind of true with chlorophyll too. So chlorophyll is the pigment absorbs that sun energy, and it's able to absorb all of these energy, which in specific wavelength. So we can kind of think with regards to visible light, that the wavelength will have a certain light to them. Chlorophyll absorbs all this light, but it doesn't absorb green light. And so it's actually reflecting back green light, and that's why they look green to us. Whoops, sorry. We also have other pigments that are involved called carotenoid. Carotenoid is an accessory pigment, and it absorbs. You can see over here, they have different wavelengths that they can absorb and reflect. So carotenoid actually reflects yellow and orange. And so we're going to look in a little bit about how seasons make it so that you go from green leaves to yellow leaves in the fall. So in the summer, chlorophyll is able to absorb violet, blue, and red wavelength best. So you have warmer weather, there's more daylight, right? It's really hot, but I mean, other than the fact that it gets super hot, I love summer. So a lot of chlorophyll is being produced, and so so the leaf is just absorbing tons of different colors and reflecting back that green light. And so the leaves look green because it reflects back that green light. So the accessory pigment, the carotenoid, is still producing or is still absorbing the other wavelength, the orange and yellow and the red, is still reflecting that. I misspoke the way I said that. It's still reflecting those wavelengths and it's still absorbing all the other wavelengths. But we don't see orange, red, and yellow. So in the fall, when you are having the chlorophyll no longer being produced and not absorbing the pigment, the carotenoid, which absorbs violet, blue, and green, is now going to be more dominant in what we actually observe. So it reflects back yellow and orange light. And so that's why in fall we see yellow and orange light, because the chlorophyll is no longer masking the production of the lights that's being reflected back to us. That's from the carotenoid. So here I'm showing you this reaction right here. This is the light-dependent reaction of photosynthesis. So I'm trying to figure out where to put this. Okay. So we have our first set where the sun stimulates photosystem 2. Why is it photosystem 2, not photosystem 1? This is just, the reaction occurs left to right here. Whoops, sorry. But it's named based on when it was discovered. So photosystem 1 was discovered before photosystem 2. So photosystem 1 is going to absorb energy from the sun, and it's going to say, yay, I'm going to take some electron and get some from the breakage of water as well. Remember that water is going to break, form CO2. Hydrogen is going to go across into this gradient right here. And we're going to have photosystem 2 grab those electrons. It's going to move the electron through here and go to the electron transport chain. And then in the transport chain, some of the energy is lost in the electron because they're moving through, because as you move across the system, it's just losing energy. Anyway, some of the energy is also being used to, you see how we see the movement of hydrogen? We're going to move that hydrogen because we're going to use it so we can make ATP. So the hydrogen is being moved against this concentration gradient, which is why it takes some energy. So then this light energy keeps moving, and this electron is going to be the energy source in photosystem 2. So now we're going to have that, remember the ATP and NADPH that were created? We are going to use some of the electrons from that to actually move into photosystem 1. So photosystem 1 is going to take the electron from photosystem 2 that moved through. It's going to take that electron and it's going to pass it on to the NADP and the ATP. Because remember, we're going to make some energy in here. We're going to use that energy to then move it over to this last part, which is the ATP synthase. And the ATP synthase is going to use the advantage of the fact that there's all this hydrogen in here to move it with its concentration gradient. And when it moves it with this concentration gradient, it spins that ATP synthase, and ATP synthase is able to synthesize ATP. So what I want you to take from this right here is that you have light energy that drives the electron out, and the electron travels all the way down this whole pathway. In the process, a little bit of energy is constantly being lost because this takes some work, and so there's a little bit of energy is constantly being lost. But while it's going through the system, we're using some of that energy to pump hydrogen against this concentration gradient, so we can build a large amount of hydrogen within that compartment. This is going to play a role in the very end with regards to ATP synthesis, where we're going to synthesize ATP by moving hydrogen along its concentration gradient. And moving it along, it's going to spin this ATP synthesis, and that energy from spinning ATP synthesis is going to be used to synthesize more ATP. All right, great. So let's kind of think about this. Where does ATP get made? Well, ATP is mainly going to get made in the ATP synthesis. How does NADPH get made? Well, we talked about how we're going to use that solar energy in the light reaction to capture the electron and pass the electron and hydrogen to NAD plus, which will make NADPH. And how does oxygen get released? Well, oxygen is going to get released in the very beginning when we're breaking up our water to harvest that hydrogen. We're going to release oxygen as kind of like our byproduct, I want to say. I'll go ahead and just show you this video real quick. It's only a minute long.
The light-dependent phase of photosynthesis involves two groups of light-absorbing molecules found in the thylakoid membranes, called photosystem 2 and photosystem 1. They are clusters of light-trapping molecules which funnel energy to special trap molecules. When excited, these special trap pigments release energized electrons. An acceptor molecule picks up the energized electrons and passes them down
That's the
transporting
NADP,
molecules in the thylakoid membrane.
NADPH.
Due to this passage of electrons, hydrogen ions accumulate inside the thylakoid.
Yeah.
The energy from this proton gradient is harnessed to synthesize energetic ATP. In an all-important phase, the splitting of water replaces the electrons lost by photosystem 2's trap molecule. This step is critical because it generates hydrogen ions for the gradient. It also releases the oxygen humans and other animals need to survive. Responding to light of a different wavelength, photosystem 1's trap molecule ejects energized electrons. These electrons are picked up by different carriers until they are added to a molecule of NADP. This forms the second important product of a light phase, NADPH.
Okay, so the carrier is the NADPH. The gradient, like I said, is pumping hydrogen against its gradient, but then the gradient is going to be used at the very end to actually synthesize ATP. And that's when it's flowing with its concentration gradient. Oh, I don't want you to play this. Okay, so main things that I want you guys to think about with the light reaction. Where is the energy coming from? The sun. What does the sun do? The sun is going to provide solar energy that's going to excite electrons, and the electrons are is the absorption of the sunlight by these pigments that's going to excite the electron, and the electron is going to be used to kind of go down this pathway in order to make ATP, as well as being able to harvest in order for us to make carbohydrates. Okay, so light reaction. So in the light reaction, we eventually want to move the ATP and the NADPH into the next cycle, which is this Calvin cycle. I was going to say Calvin Klein, Calvin cycle. Okay, so photosystem 2. Electrons lost from photosystem 2 are replaced when we split the water. Remember, photosystem 2 is the first one we hit, even though it's called photosystem 2. So the electrons that's lost is going to be replaced here. We also are going to have hydrogen that's released, that's going to go into a compartment space, and oxygen that is released and going to be expelled by the plant as waste. The electron and the hydrogen is then passed on to NADP plus. The NADP plus is going to be known also as an electron carrier because it's carrying this electron, and it will become NADPH in photosystem 1. Okay. We already talked about how there's a membrane in the thylakoid. So located in the membrane is the photosystem 2 and 1, as well as the electron transport chain and the ATP synthesis complex. So we have all these components all located within the membrane space. The energy that is taken and placed into the carrier, which is the NAD plus, is then used to pump more hydrogen from the stroma into the thyroid space. We want to establish a proton gradient because we want to establish this gradient that has all this potential energy to harness that potential energy in order to make our downstream our carbohydrate and as well as making our ATP through the ATP synthase. So the electron transfer chain is going to make ATP. The electron transport chain is where the final electron is going to be sent to, and it's also where NAD plus plays a role. So there's a bunch of enzymes, coenzymes, all these other proteins. And the goal is to kind of basically pass along this electron in a series. We pass along the series because we're trying to lose as little energy as possible, like as heat, as we go through this process. If we went all the way through in one step, we might lose a lot more energy and heat that way. So we're trying to move this electron along, and at the same time, while we're doing that, we're trying to build this hydrogen gradient. This hydrogen gradient is important because it's what's going to be used to make our ATP. And the ATP synthase complex itself has pretty much like two components, which we're not going to really go into, but what you should recognize is it just has the ability to spin with regards to the proton gradient in order to make ATP. Right, and then you have an electron acceptor, which is the NADP plus. I keep forgetting to say P because there is an NAD plus as well. But we're going to look at NADP plus. It's going to accept the electron and the hydrogen, and it's going to reduce itself down to NADPH. So here's another picture of the synthesis, the ATP synthesis. The hydrogen gradient that is found between the stroma area and the thyroid membrane area, and is going to be where we have this flow of hydrogen, the hydrogen proton gradient. So the synthesis is actually located in the membrane itself. The hydrogen is going to be pumped into the thyroid space. Remember that in the first few steps, we see how hydrogen is constantly being pumped there. When we break up the water into hydrogen and oxygen, the oxygen is going to be expelled, but hydrogen goes into this into the membrane. And basically, we want to pump it into the stroma so that it's going against this gradient, and then it's going to travel all the way down to where the proton gradient, where the ATP synthesis is, and that's when it's going to go with its traveling, go with its gradient to actually spin the synthase and make ATP. So where do all the hydrogen want to go? Well, they want to go with their gradients. They all want to leave and go out the ATP synthesis. And the reason why there is a gradient is because we keep pushing hydrogen into that space. So Kava cycle is after we've done the photosynthesis part 1, which is the light reaction. We move into the Kava cycle. At this point, we have ATP and we have NADPH. So we're going to use those two as an energy source in order to run through this Kava cycle. And this Kava cycle, its goal is to make a 6-carbon sugar. That's glucose. You see, glucose chemical formula is C6H12O6. That means that it's going to be carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. That makes a carbohydrate. And there's 3 steps. You have the carbon fixation, the carbon dioxide reduction, and then regeneration of first substrate. So let's walk through those steps. So the first part is the carbon dioxide fixation. This is when the enzyme binds onto CO2, and it binds also onto RuBH, and that's going to go from 1 and 5 carbon to a 6-carbon molecule. This 6-carbon molecule, though, is going to break into 2 3-carbon molecule. And so the second part is carbon dioxide reduction. So at this point, we have a 3-carbon sugar, and we're going to convert it into another form of sugar. This is so that we have downstream enzymes have an easier time to recognize and work with that 6-carbon sugar. So this is the carbon cycle reduction. So we're reducing our molecules down. And the G3P, which is glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate, will actually be the building block of carbon itself. So in this process of the carbon cycle, it goes through all these little steps. And I want you to keep in mind it's a cycle, which means that it goes through this step. And then once it has a new substrate reaction on top, it can go through the cycle again. So this can constantly be happening as long as you have enough molecules and energy to kind of fuel it. Okay, so regeneration for substrate is right here, this molecule right here, RUBP, which stands for ribulose, sorry. Sometimes I talk too, I mumble my words because I'm like, because they're very long words in biology. Ribulose, why did I say, I think I said ribose. Sorry, you guys. Ribulose 1,5-biphosphate. That is what RUBP is. And it's the first substrate production from this cycle that we're going to actually see again. So remember, carbon dioxide from the air, sun energy, and hydrogen from the water, light reaction, moves it into the carbon cycle. The carbon cycle, for every 6-carbon sugar that we're going to make, we need to have equivalent carbon. So we're going to actually pass in 3 carbon dioxide molecule, and we're going to bind it to this other 6-carbon molecule. So a one carbon molecule of carbon dioxide. I think I might have been a little confusing there. We're going to go through the cycle 3 times. Carbon dioxide, 1 molecule of carbon dioxide binds with this other molecule that is C6, and together they're going to make this intermediate that would then break from 6 carbon into, I'm mixing this up. Sorry, you guys. I should choose the picture, but you can see. Our substrate, this is our first substrate that goes in. Our substrate is our 5-carbon sugar. 5 carbon adds to 1 carbon dioxide. 1 plus 5 makes 6. 6 carbon right here. The 6 carbon is going to break into 3 carbon. The 3 carbon is going to go through isoform, where it's basically just going to go through this reaction, and it's going to come back, and you end up with another molecule. So you end up with a 6 carbon. This 6 carbon is going to be converted into another 6 carbon. So we're doing all this stuff to convert these molecules into other molecules because certain chemical reactions are easier when the molecule has a certain form to it. So that's why we're doing all of this. And our goal in the end is to leave that carbon cycle making glucose. This gets recycled. Once we actually make it, we'll actually end up with the substrate. The end product would then just be recycled again, and then we end up with the substrate starting the reaction all over again. So this is a cycle. So my main thing that I want you to take away from this is our end goal in the carbon cycle is to make carbohydrates, to make the glucose molecule. I want you to recognize that these molecules that's in the cycle gets recycled. So we're every single time that we do spin in the cycle, we're recycling the ribulose 1,5-biphosphate and taking a piece of carbon dioxide and just cycling through this, so the end product is a glucose molecule. All right, that's the last slide. I hope that wasn't super confusing. I think I stumbled upon a little bit when I was trying to explain it. I hope that you guys got it. So just think, products get recycled in a common cycle. Carbon dioxide comes in and interacts with RUBP. The end goal is to get glucose. That's the main things that I hope that you take away from this. Let's look at the study guide I have for you guys and just make sure that we answer everything. This is chapter 6. Okay, what is photosynthesis? Who performs it? Remember, it's the conversion of solar into chemical and producers, which includes plants, but not limited to plants. Where does carbon dioxide come from? That's used in photosynthesis. It comes from the atmosphere, pretty much. It comes from the air. Where does the oxygen gas produced during photosynthesis exit the plant? It's actually going to exit out the leaves, and it is the gas that is the byproduct of when we break water up. What are the two main parts of photosynthesis? The light reaction, which whole goal of the light reaction is to pass that energy into an electron carrier, NADPH, as well as into ATP. The second part is the Calvin cycle. The Calvin cycle is the process where that's when we actually take the carbon dioxide, combine it with our substrate, and make the glucose. What is the role of the thyroid membrane in the light reaction? The thyroid membrane is the one that has all of these different components. So it has the whole photosystem 1 and 2 there, as well as the ATP synthase. And the role of that is pretty much to make ATP. How are ATP and NADPH produced during light reaction? You have it being made by the solar energy, grabbing an electron from there and passing it into these molecules. You also have it from when you actually use the proton gradient to have hydrogen be able to go with its gradient concentration and electrical gradient, because remember, hydrogen is also charged, the proton is charged, and using it to be able to harness and synthesize ATP, right? What is the purpose of the Calvin cycle reaction? We kind of talked about that. And the main purpose of that is to actually form our glucose molecule. How are the carbon dioxide and water converted into glucose during the Calvin cycle? So we already kind of covered this, right? The carbon dioxide is going to be what binds to the substrate, and the water is what's used in photosystem 2. And that electron and that hydrogen is why we break up water, and we're going to pass that whole energy and electrons eventually down to the Calvin cycle, so we can make carbohydrates. What is the role of chlorophyll and the pigment photosynthesis? The role here is to be able to actually absorb that solar energy, right? And keep in mind the different periods of fall versus summer, and why sometimes leaves are green versus why sometimes they're yellow, orange. And oh, that's the next question. I forgot I put that question out. How do leaves color change from summer to fall? So just think about the pigments and how much sun is available at that time, and based on how much sun is available, what lights are available. So whatever wavelength of visible lights that's available, that's kind of what's being absorbed. And so during summer, we're absorbing light waves that have a little more energy, high energy, because they're warm, and because of how long the daylight's out and all these other factors. Whereas later on, we have a little bit less light, so we are more stringent in which light energy is visible, and the chlorophyll is not producing as much. So it's not as green as before, but the other pigments, they're always kind of in the background producing, but now it's their time to shine. Because the green's a little bit more muted, so now all the orange and yellow and red leaves are here to shine. So they come on over and they reflect their pigments. Okay, as always, please write me any questions you may have, or bring it up there in lab. Bring up any questions you guys might have, and or in the discussion board, and I'll be happy to re-explain and give you another explanation or another perspective on how to think about photosynthesis. And I will see you guys in lab. Bye.